Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's been quite some time since I've made any new recordings, and I'm feeling a little bit nervous and kind of excited. I have recently returned from an extremely problematical holiday that was a lot more like, I don't know, a prison sentence than a vacation or a birthday or a holiday. So, part of the wonderful, exuberant joy of my recent experience was becoming extremely sick. Let's see, around the 18th, I guess, and dumping sweat into my blankets for 5 or 6 days. And various other monumental misadventures that thankfully are now behind me. I'm excited to be in the gardens today. It's been quite some time since I've been here. Police helicopters above notwithstanding. I was observing a young man who was apparently totally oblivious to the incursion signaling of a large male Opspini in Blackfoot, snow goose, Canadian goose in English. He was approaching, the man was approaching a female, and the nearby guardian male became increasingly irate and began to signal very blatantly, obviously, in a way that the young man approaching the female was apparently completely oblivious to. And what ended up happening was complex. Now, I'm not sure about my interpretation of this, but an interpretation is a lot in such circumstances, unless somehow we have either very accurate intuition or non-ordinary insight, right, into what is the male actually doing, right? What's the best approximation of its behavior that we can form as an explanation. Now, of course, these are linguistic behaviors of humans, right, to form explanations of observed behavior, so forth. So that's already a huge problem because it's so removed from the enaction of embodied being on the part of the animals. Completely different realms, right? Explanation, embodied behavior. But we must imagine there can be some crossover. I wish to. So what I saw was something really strange, which I'll just give you my interpretation of it. Eventually, the male goose, some 50 feet away from the male human, who's approaching a recumbent female, for sure. Well, is that for sure? Eventually, the goose, which is honking and making displays very loudly, makes a running, flying pass at the human and the recumbent goose of at least potentially indeterminate gender, but given its behavior, I think it was female. So the angry goose makes a low-flying pass at the pair and appears to be directing its ire, in hindsight, at the goose rather than the human. And I can imagine that it might be extremely unsafe, will get you killed and your mate, to direct anger at the human. Goose is probably aware of this fact. So maybe it's displacing its ire onto the goose that's attracting the attention of the human, thereby violating the possibility of present and future safety in the domain. Now, admittedly, this is an elaborate attempt at explanation. And yet, I suspect there's at least some degree of veracity here. So, I've just come from a conversation in which I was mostly spectating or being talked to, talked at by my friend Dr. Kevin Baru, a neuroscientist and longtime companion of my mind. Dr. Baru has been an indefatigable enemy of most of what I believe and most of what I admire and pursue for many years. So he's the kind of a frenemy that I use as a whetstone for my own learning, self-correction, insight, growth, and being willing to be talked at, sometimes for hours, by Dr. Baru, has certainly resulted in me learning all kinds of things, particularly about math, physics, the immune system, neuroscience, hemispheric lateralization, the Greeks, anamnesis, lots of things. So, even though the experience isn't always very kind or inviting, the results tend to be quite rewarding. And he was opining on the brilliance of Spinoza, the assertion that there is something resembling a singular universal intelligence, i.e. monotheism, and the rejection of rationality, equality, and humanity, common to those who worship fascists, adored Hitler, or were devotees of Heidegger, particularly, who he sees as effectively a Nazi. And He's very concerned with the efflorescence of anti-science, anti-math, anti-rationality, absolutist perspectives, single-valued thinking. If we can just destroy science and math, the gods will return from their chthonic hibernations, and we will become messiahs. Very interesting, incredibly confused perspective. I am visiting my profoundly favored white sage plants. And the hummingbird sages are greening. Those are going to be gooey in a few months. Is this little bird? What are you going to do, little sparrow? I'm going to pause for a moment and we'll return shortly. So, Dr. Baru has his preferred perspectives to criticize, denigrate, and point out the trenchant evil of. And these are things such as anti-rationality, fascism, and those who are devoted to various kinds of religious or perhaps even aesthetic fundamentalism, as he sees it. In my own creative and intellectual development, the surrealists, particularly some of the women, Remedios Varo, Leonora Carrington, Dorothea Tanning, among many unnamed others, were heroically catalytic, and in a sense were, I think of these women as mind parents, and some of the men as well. Philippe Soupeau, Paul Eluard, Jean Cocteau, Antonin Artaud, and many others had profound influences on my own creative questing and sometimes very confused creative and intellectual adventures. Confused primarily due, I think, to my trenchant naivete about matters sublime, mystical, or non-ordinary. What is the word that means redolent of the dreaming? It's on the tip of my vocabulary, but I can't find it. Oniric. Oh, I got it. Wow. Yeah. My attempts to return some experience of the oniric to waking life and particularly creative endeavor and play, which I see as fundamentally crucial to any hope of deeply embodied human relation and experience and awareness. So there's also a word for something one likes to attack, and it reminds me of like a lure that easily triggers somebody's war mind, so to speak, even if the primary expression of this is intellectual. And I think of it like a toy horse of some kind. And I'm reminded of the word in Hebrew, shibboleth, but I'm afraid that I may have the meaning wrong. What I remember of this word is, well, my associations with the word in consciousness and cognition are a kind of a test that enemies can't pass, right? That comes from the very grave difficulty of non-native speakers to properly pronounce a specific word in Hebrew or Aramaic, perhaps. And this may be entirely wrong, as may much of my current thought and talk. So I've recently, very long-windedly, come from listening to Kevin attacking Wittgenstein, one of his favorite targets, and Heidegger, another favorite target, Jung, another favorite target, and I think he'd be inclined to group all of these people together under the rubric of Nazi sympathy, sympathism to Nazism. Now myself, I only have the kind of vaguest, a fairly vague idea of what is actually represented or pointed at when the term Nazi is used. Obviously it has very dark and dire connotations, such as bigotry, hate, extreme entitlement fantasies, the genetic manipulation and or destruction of humans based on some mystical narrative of inherent God-chosen supremacy. All of these kinds of truly disgusting and extremely dire ignorances pathologies. And I guess one could imagine that such thought and similar strains of thought that infest the American cognitium presently, that being the network of the minds of the people that live in this country and the diseases that they trade among each other, often celebrating them under the guise of either it can go either way, right? It can be extreme conservatism on the one hand, and it can be the bizarre left reification of insanities that arise from extremities of either moral relativism, meaning nothing has intrinsic truth, it's all just relative to whatever's at play, or moral relativism, or bizarre jingoist acceptance of lethally misfounded principles that, while raising the flag of some form of ethical advancement or insight, are actually captivated by one lethal pathology or a cluster of them. And many of these situations and thrisps are endemic to the gardens of what we might refer to as political correctness or identity politics. This is not to say that there's no seed of virtue in either of those fields, but rather that the primary function, result, and general outcome of these largely linguistic behaviors, which I see as pathologically thrisp structured, meaning communicable linguistic disease. Shit, now I've really dug myself in a hole here. Yeah, so look, the hope of, again, we're like any move we make in language, we've already gone backward 19 steps from where we want to, from the land we hope to travel to. So if I say, for example, the quest for equality is noble, the one thing that must be absolutely obvious about being human is uniqueness. Yes, we're each human. Yes, we mostly fulfill the criteria for the category and so forth, especially physically. But the idea of equality is a strangely conflicted ideal, because by the time you have to have arguments about whether humans are equal or not, you must have already defected from everything that's embodied and relationally true and human and alive about living as a communal being together for each other and the world, right? By the time the arguments about equality have arisen, or must arise, The same is true of the problem of human rights. By the time you have to encode the rights of humans in any way at all, the whole basis from which those virtues arise has been disposed of summarily, right? Just summarily, like fucking burnt down. So it's really ironic because we argue for the existence of virtues like equality. It truly is a virtue, but once it's made explicit, it's a hopeless situation, right? Because the virtue has to exist in situ prior to declarations, prior to assertions, in the actual nature of the relationships that are integral to our moment-to-moment experience as beings on earth in this time. So we are faced with these staggering ironies. But where I was going was just that there's a diseased branch, there's a family of diseased branches on the tree of whatever we might think of as the left that are, they signal virtue but deliver atrocity and otherizing. And my goal here, actually, when I began this talk, was to discuss the relationship to discuss the overlap, the consilience, the integrative aspects of truth and beauty. And partly that was because I felt that the activities of the young man in relation to the geese were a violation of truth. And thus also ugly. The man was bemused. He believed he was having a nature moment. And perhaps I am uniquely disposed to find this really disturbing and maybe even upsetting and angering. But maybe I'm uniquely disposed toward that sort of critique because thereby I do this all the time. I have done the same thing. In my recent essay, Ladybird Was Angry With Me, which you can find on Medium, I talk at length about a situation in which I am doing precisely what that young man was doing. Even worse, because I'm someone who, I like to think of myself as someone who's actually capable of paying deep attention to the animals and insects and plants and the living places and the sky and so forth. So, when it turns out that I'm doing exactly the opposite of what I believe I am up to, and am so enamored of my fairy tale that I'm placing myself and the beings that I love directly in the jaws of death, and having no awareness of this, that might have something to do with why I was so ready to criticize the young man's behavior. Now, beauty these two topics, truth and beauty, they relate in a way to the conversation I was having or was being subjected to by Kevin. Recently, somebody I was close to was asking me questions about the meaning of words. And I don't feel I'm celebrating a kind of moral relativism when I explained to her that she was asking me how I might interpret a specific word, the word some, S-O-M-E, in a text communication she had received. And she provided the dictionary definition of some. And I responded that since she was actually asking me what I felt was meant by the word, it was clear to me that it did not mean a few. It rather meant all. And I explained that although we might be tempted to apply the dictionary definition of a single word, we never encounter single words. What we encounter are ensembles of words within the field of which the meaning of a given word is nuanced and given shading and color and torque and flavor and, extra dimensionality. And I said to my friend in text, I wrote to my friend, I should say, that we should be careful of the urge or expectation to validate the concerns of those with whom we are close, rather than actually working to see more clearly together somehow. Because what we really want is insight, not validation. Right? I certainly do not wish to have my ignorance validated. I don't wish to have my blindness celebrated. I don't want to be rewarded into zombie-like confusion by well-wishing friends who are ready to act as the sycophants of my dumbest inclinations. So I was explaining that to my friend that, while two of your other friends validated your concerns here, I think given the actual ensemble of words and its context, I'm going to push back and say, no, it didn't mean a few, it meant all in this case. I could give similar examples in which the use of the word some actually indicates the entire set, right? Even though that the appearance of the word by itself would indicate a few, a selection. For example, one might say, we went to this restaurant, and I got to tell you, that was some amazing food. We don't mean, in this case, some of the food was amazing. We mean all of the food that we had was amazing. But yes, I'm very suspicious of thrisp-like cultural linguistic behaviors that raise the flag of virtue and deliver atrocity and otherizing. And I'm also very suspicious of anything that wants to courtroom-like preserve, for the sake of new and further indictments, some historical stupidity, insanity, or malignance of humans. We must find the terrain ahead and go very fervently and passionately together to those noble and beautiful places in the possibility space of our humanity that we can together found, find, establish, nurture, and sustain. There is no time for endless court cases of historical wrongdoing and the prosecution, persecution, cancellation, and otherwise, misguided criticism. Misguided because in the urge to indict, we fail to establish something better, right? So busy attacking something that we've lost the thread of our potential for transcending it together right now, I can hear critics in the background saying things such as, you're a white, middle-aged European male. The fuck do you know? Well, okay. Feel free to see me that way. If you're going to collapse the manifold of my humanity to a series of puppets that you can direct your attacks at easily and seemingly effectively, if that's the best move you've got, no wonder you're so committed to it. You're a one-legged centipede there. But even if I take those criticisms seriously, those categorical, racist, genderist, bigoted criticisms seriously, what the hell am I supposed to think? What are we supposed to think? That there are some categories of humans that shall have no voices because of their purported historical association with pathological malignance, evil. What the category determines my humanity? If that's true, then everything hopeful and useful and brilliant about being human is false. Because we should recognize racism and genderism and assaults on privilege and so forth as useful only where they are actually useful and produce some truth, some noble benefit that we can deeply trust. And we should reject them out of hand wherever they do not, or when they appear as the arbiters of virtue while actually delivering like desecration of the nature, opportunity, and origins of our being as humans on earth today. But I've accidentally wandered into a quagmire again. That wasn't necessarily my intention. I'm very suspicious of politico-cultural linguistic movements that mimic virtue while having atrocity as most of what they actually deliver. And that atrocity is usually or often composed by otherizing, by segmenting the population and determining which ones we should dismiss, attack, destroy, invalidate. That's not virtue. Nor does that resemble the principle, whether we value it or not, the principles that underlie the nature of what we imagine as democracy, perhaps in its idealized rather than its representational forms. I am a devotee of beauty, and in thinking, in cognition, in language, beauty is an infinite direction. It's one of the directions on the complex compass on which rationality is another, fanaticism is another. Right? There's lots of directions on this compass, not four. Fundamentalism, religiosity, scientism. Scientism being the dogmatic promulgation of and sustainment of theories that are not preserved due to their veracity, they're preserved due to being doctrine. Right? They are doctrinally defended, which is the opposite of what science should be. I heard Steven Pinker the other day saying that it's an absolute fact that no one has ever experienced telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, right? That all of these things are absolutely false, and that every single instance of them that was ever occurred in human history was trickery. And I'm exaggerating only very slightly the vehemence of his position on this. And quite frankly, it is absolutely bullshit. He's completely wrong. In fact, without a little telepathy or precognition, we're not going to have minds at all. Right? Minds are about telepathy and precognition, partly. And without those ingredients, you don't get minds. You don't get the minds with which you can refute such things. Now, I would argue that both telepathy and precognition are concepts in which we may find a reasonable degree of fakery, chicanery, and so forth. The little bird, it's Forrest's daughter, I think, or at least his old mate. The fact that people can counterfeit art in no way has any effect on the existence of genuine art. You cannot say because art can be counterfeited, there are no genuine artifacts. It's formally untrue. Yet this is the style of thinking we so often encounter in the common behavior of the masses and the worst common denominators of culture, humanity, cognition. I was surprised because Pinker was in conversation with Sadhguru, and I thought that Sadhguru would be unlikely to agree that all that all telepathy, precognition, channeling, oraclery, and so forth was all just a big bag of tricks. But Sadhguru did agree. For some reason, he found it. I don't, by the way, believe that means Sadhguru agrees. It only means that in the context at hand, Sadhguru selected agreement as the right move, or useful move, or move he intended to take, because it's obvious to Sadhguru that there's no such thing as a separate mind in the first place. He does go on to say that. So, if there's no such thing as a separate mind, our minds must be connected with minds in the past, in the future, with the whole field of minds, in all of time, right? And not be anything like a personal, localized possession. Maybe Sadhguru was willing to plant his flag there rather than on the relatively shaky ground of, is ESP an actual thing? Is that real? Which it blatantly, obviously is, even if we have the idea backwards, so that it's our delusion of separate-mindedness that produces the category of the extrasensory, right? The transhuman, the transpersonal. It's our first principle mistake of imagining, oh no, our minds are separate. This is Darren's mind, a possession of Darren's, which is as common as a supposition as it is absurd. By common, I mean the trenchant fact of my common moment-to-moment thinking right now. Right? My direct experience is redolent of this monumental fiction. this fallacy, so that even while I decry it, I'm decrying it with a mind that validates it. Does the irony get any thicker? Kevin is very concerned about the sacrifice of facticity, procedure by proof, logical, rigorous expressions of human cognition, enactions, right? Activities, behaviors in human cognition, in the mind. He wants a deeply rigorous, trenchant, concrete basis for any future movement and for the possibility of evaluating trust, virtue, nobility, beauty, all these things, all these properties. And he is an ardent opponent of E.A. McGilchrist, who is one of my heroes, actually. As I mentioned, Kevin is ardently opposed to much of what I have reverence for. He doesn't believe, for example, that the complex of the fingers of the mind that we would associate with what you get if you shut off the right hemisphere, as in the WADA test, right, where you just anesthetize one hemisphere. He doesn't believe that the complex of fingertips that you'd get want the death or eviction of the dreaming aspect in mind and so forth. The right hemispheres, complementary fingertips. But I see that as blatantly obvious that it does want that. It's dissective, it's very interested in parts. It is all about utilization and grasping in the sense of reifying as a tool anything it comes into contact with and rejecting anything that it cannot make such use of, whereas the complementary aspect is interested in beauty, truth, in terms of the nature of being in relation, rather than the nature of the evaluations of syllogisms in a sequence. And this is a different mode of truth, though both modes can be beautiful. But there are certainly forms of truth that so catastrophically transcend provability. And these are the gardens where insight is conceived and nurtured and given birth to and, fed. And by insight, I mean that which is almost intrinsically virtuous. Long before any rule-based analysis, right? Like transcendentally virtuous. And there's a relationship here between truth as a principle and beauty, rather than truth as an analytic derivative and beauty. Though again, even in the latter, there's something there in in many cases. It struck me so profoundly when I realized that there are toys of truth that are so profound and beautiful and actually redolent of insight that they completely overwhelm the nature of declarative truths, or that which can be proven, right? Analytic truth. And I would argue that beauty, or whatever I may mean by this, but I mean a principle that is intrinsic to human awareness, desire, affinity, and so forth. That these are, in many ways, two wings on the same bird, truth and beauty. But what staggered me was when I realized there were as if stories, right? Look at a situation as if, from some perspective, productive or generative of insight, wonder, awe, understanding, awareness. There are positions that the truthfulness of the proposed perspective doesn't matter at all. Literally does not matter, because what is produced by inhabiting the perspective, even very briefly, is so profound and so generative of understanding that the nominal truthfulness or falsity of the perspective doesn't matter. Literally doesn't count, right? We don't count it. Any perspective that gives you more degrees of liberty than some nominally true perspective would, we're going to want the liberty, right? We're not gonna be saying like, no, I don't want that liberty because it's not true. Right? The perspective isn't truthful. And I guess in this case, what I mean by truthful is both beautiful and profound in terms of liberation, right? Liberating the eye, EYE, the seeing aspect, liberating the mind, liberating the spirit, returning liberties that have been previously foreclosed, generously and without any concern for economics, right? No one's worried about who's going to get paid. And it seems to me that both truth with a capital T, so to speak, and beauty with a capital B, these are two wings on the same bird that I trust and know as their spirits in those priorities and urgencies of which I am comprised, for which I am comprised. The purpose of my existence, the living purpose, not the nominal purposes, the living, original, true purposes of my being are bound up with origin, beauty, and truth as directions on the compass of being, and as the very foundation of anything resembling a trustworthy evaluation. Even if we're going to become analytic, right? we're going to have the same problem. A friend who recognizes me is very valuable. It's funny, you know, only the male birds will come to my hand. Doesn't everyone? Yeah. Well, peanut is a language that nearly every corvid speaks. He asked me if I talk to birds. And I said, doesn't everyone? So yes, in our thinking aspect, we may choose what to believe, evaluatively. But in our deepest interiority, we do not choose what to believe. We know, we can sense intrinsically whether something is true or beautiful or good. And yes, there are layers in the concentric circles where that can be counterfeited, and we can be sold representations instead. And then we lose degrees of liberty. Each time we accept this counterfeiting, degrees of liberty in our being, in our relationships, in our cognition, in our intelligence are lost. Yeah. And this is the fundamental game played by modernity on us, is to replace the intrinsically true and beautiful and noble origin and nature with lethally addictive representations and endless new forms of them, so that we begin to suffocate in a circus of images and tokens of all that we bring to our human birth complete, that are inviolate urgencies and foundations of our own being. And these are occluded, and we are sold back ever more. We are sold back copies and images and boxes and so forth that are ever more degrading, enslaving, addictive, false, and yet somehow have the seed of the thing counterfeited in them, such that we find them at least conveniently desirable. And this is agonic. I mean, this is hell. My friend the J is with me. A moment and I will return. You know, I speak of these things, I can see and sense them in myself, but that does not necessarily mean that I can accomplish or enact their resurrection, preservation. What I can do is recall. What I can do is remember. What I can do is an anamnesis whereby I show the structure of how the traps were comprised that snared my own heart, that continue to snare my own body, my own mind, my own humanity, my own hope of living in the service of beauty and truth and origin and nature, all of which I deeply trust, and not the categories, not the words, but rather that which the words point toward. And that was the hope of my speech today, of my talk today, was to remember the nature of the true and the beautiful, far beyond systematizations, categorics, language itself, description, explanation, syllogism. No, the shining light of the origin of our being, in whom our souls take their urgent and most and richest pleasure of reunion and communion, awakening, insight, adoration, wonder, play, awe. The true directions on the compass that I love and that I hope to serve as in my human life, however humbly my service oft becomes. However humbling my service oft becomes. There's so much more to learn and understand and become together. But if we can at least see through the labyrinth of representations of virtue and representations of beauty and representations of truth, if we can clarify our vision together such that we are not thereby deceived, then our hope will flourish and surely produce the memorial liberations we ache to resurrect together. Thank you for joining me. I wish you every true and beautiful way and relation in your life, your heart, your thought, and your situations. Bye-bye for now.